What's up, everybody? Thank you so much for tuning in to another inspiring episode of the iChooseSeries podcast. This episode originally aired January 2019, and we speak with John Spencer, who talks about anxiety and overcoming the challenges of life.
Yeah, so I currently live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I've lived here for about, 17 years now. I moved here in 2001. The day after Christmas 2001, and I met my wife here a few months later. We got married the next year, 2003, and I've been here ever since. 2 kids later, here I am talking to you.
Wow, man, that's awesome. Well, congratulations. I'm a dad too. I got 3.
Congrats. That's awesome.
Yep, I've been to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I believe that's is that like the Amish country?
They got Amish out here. Yep, sure do.
And yeah, that's about all I know.
Yeah, yep. They love their horse and buggy on the side of the road. That's for sure.
Cool, man. Well, I think one of the reason that I was very, very attracted to having you come on our show specifically was because, if I'm not mistaken, some of your posts seem to be dealing with anxiety and some stuff like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's that one day I had an anxiety attack and it just wasn't going away. And that was the one that you saw. I just got on Facebook Live and I said, I want to turn the camera on anxiety, because typically when we go through something like that, whether it's depression, anxiety, we tend to internalize. And I know that from my experience, that is a very dangerous place to live. When you're internalizing and you're always turning inward, you're always feeling alone and always feeling by yourself. And that's when you can kind of get attacked through that. And so I said, you know what? I felt kind of misleading, because my wife and I went for a walk and everything was hunky-dory to her. But when we got back home, I said, I'm going to do a Facebook Live. She was going shopping and she's like, oh, what are you going to talk about? I'm like, anxiety. She said, what? I said, I'm having an anxiety attack right now. And I just feel led to go live and talk about it, because I feel like too many people internalize. And I feel like somebody needs to hear that there is that they need to talk to somebody. And I just turned the camera on and I started talking about it, and I bumbled and rambled my way through it. But it led to us talking tonight. So who knows? Maybe it needs to be heard by more people.
Yeah, man. So for everyone who's just tuning in right now, this is episode 17. We're speaking with John Spencer from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Leave a comment. Let us know where you're watching from. Hit that like button. We're about to get into some stuff talking about anxiety. I think what was really, I think that this is an incredibly important topic to discuss. I think that anxiety, stress, I think that we live in a world right now where it's just, people don't know how to friggin' relax. I really believe that, man. We just don't know how to relax. Yeah. And so when I saw your live and you were talking about some of the anxiety, first of all, I have to commend you for the courage of just being brave enough to kind of talk about the vulnerability of what it is that you were going through. I know that, for myself and for a lot of other people, sometimes it's easy to mask that stuff, Sure. So you just being vulnerable and talking about it, has anxiety been something that you've dealt with for a long time?
Yes, I've had my fair share of anxiety. I've had my fair share of depression, wading through all those things. And sometimes defining what the difference is between depression and anxiety it's kind of like trying to, stick Jello to the wall or nail Jello to the wall, as I've heard it described. But yeah, I've dealt with anxiety since probably the first time I can fully remember was when I was 6 years old. And, that's been 31 years, and maybe there was anxious thoughts before then, but pretty severely in my teen years. Yeah, and so I think the best way to set this up might be to say that I'm a creative by nature. I don't know if you can see behind me, but there's a bunch of camera gear.
Oh, cool. That's right. I did see, since we've been following each other, I saw that you were doing a shoot. You were carrying
Yeah.
that big Canon 70 to 300, it looked like. I couldn't tell in the picture.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Um,
I'm
so,
a film
uh,
guy too, so that's
yeah,
awesome, man.
I've seen your film. That was an incredible story. I love the true heart of what you're capturing, and just uh, to be honest, like I really do find that there's a lot of power in our testimony. You know, in the
Mm,
stories that we live, and the stories that we breathe through, and the stories that we can struggle and thrive through. Sometimes I feel like a lot of people are just trying to get by to make it by, and then there are those that want to kind of dig into the narrative of what life has to offer,
yeah.
and say, hey, there's more here, and I want to dive in a little bit deeper. But, sometimes anxiety is a part of that, and you have to learn how to deal with it and navigate through it. Um, so I know for me, like I've actually been a big guy my whole life. So I think my story would best be framed from 11 years old. I was kind of a bigger, stockier guy. Came from a larger family, Dad was 6'2", whatever, 6'2.5", 250 pounds. And through my high school year, I was always one of the tallest kids, for sure. In like, oh gosh, like fifth grade, just towering over everybody. Everybody said you were going to be a basketball player. uh, I don't really have any desire to play sports like that, so it was not really an attraction. And then when I was a big guy, it was like you're going to play football, But a lot of my anxiety and maybe even self-worth came from the labels that people gave me. Like, oh,
Mm,
you're good at this, so you should be that, or you're good at this, so you should do that. And it always kind of just went against who I felt like I was. And I would identify with what they were talking about and who I should be. And it just didn't feel right. It didn't feel like that was the journey I was supposed to go on. Like I said, I'm a creative. So one of the first memories I have was teaching myself how to write. I was like 4 years old. I was watching Scooby Doo, laying on the floor, just drawing letters because I didn't know how to spell. And I would take the paper to my mom and say, "Mom, what does this say?" And she would, say, "Oh, it doesn't say anything. You got something close here." So the day I wrote my name for the first time, the first word I ever spelled, John, she was like, "Oh, you spelled your name." And then I was looking at this paper, realizing I can create something from nothing almost,
mm.
and then there can be a reaction to that. And so then I fell in love with writing and stories, and then grew into loving the arts and wanting to be an artist and wanting to draw cartoons and wanting to be a filmmaker and being the next Spielberg and so on and so forth. You can see the evolution of this. um, but
I
then I
love
fell
it.
in love. I fell in love with writing, specifically because writing is free. As you might know, filmmaking takes a lot of time and a lot of resources,
Yeah.
specifically finances, and sometimes that's not the best. That's not the easiest way to go about it. But writing is free, and I spent lots of years in this room just hammering away at stories and so forth. And that really led me to investigate more, as far as writers and so forth, and trying to model myself after somebody else, comparing myself or living vicariously through other authors. And I came across Donald Miller. I don't know if you've ever heard of him before.
Mm.
But I read this book that literally changed my life. It's called A Million Miles in 1,000 Years. And so he wrote a book called Blue Like Jazz. You might have heard about it. And they made that book into a movie. And this book, A Million Miles in 1,000 Years, chronicles the journey that it took for them to make his memoir into a film. And it was, obviously the story had changed, but the subtitle to the book is What I Learned by Editing My Life. And
Mm.
he talks about storytelling and his quest to learn how stories are told. Um, and it really kind of allowed me to embark on this journey as well, to like learning like what makes a good story, and wait, we can actually live a good story. What the elements that go into a great movie go into a great life. You have a protagonist who wants something, and they have to overcome great conflict in order to get it. That is the essence of all story. And so I love that we can apply those same principles to our lives.
Yeah, I gotta say, man, I'm sitting here listening to you, and so I'm a writer first. That was my first love, writer director, and so when this whole I Choose thing came about, I mean, the tagline was "You are the lead in your life story,"
Yeah.
because that's what it is. The greatest films that we love are about characters, the lead characters, overcoming the challenges and the difficulties and facing against other characters, making the choice to overcome and achieve or become what it is that they're supposed to be, you know?
Yeah.
So I mean, we're on the same page of the same book.
Yeah. And it really took that awakening for me to really just say, what can I get out of life? Like you
Yeah,
get one of these. This
yeah,
is a limited edition.
yeah,
Your life is a limited edition. So
yeah.
why don't we tell the best story we can?
Hmm.
And I'm a man of faith. So like I love how the Bible has so many incredible stories weaved into it. And there are two stories specifically, two stories, one in the beginning and one at the end, actually. Um, the story of Joseph, at the very end of Joseph's story, at the end of Genesis. After Jacob dies, I believe the brothers get scared again after they've sold him into slavery, and he was raised up in Egypt and became second in command in Egypt. And his brothers were scared after their father died that he was going to return the evil that they had done to him since his father was gone. And he said, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." And I just
Mm.
love what our story what our story could be for someone else, and that I've been a firm believer of this for years now, especially after going through reading that book and so forth, that when we're possessors of knowledge, we're inclined to give that away.
Yeah,
And I think that what happens is when people, I don't want to say learn the tricks to life, because I don't think there really are any tricks to life, but like when we learn how to navigate something, um, sometimes we tend to just hold on to it and be like, this is mine, when in all honesty, just being vulnerable and opening up is the greatest gift you could give somebody.
yeah. I have to say, I mean, I agree with you 1,000%. I'm looking at some of the comments here. We have Angie who says, anxiety has kept me from doing a lot the last couple of years. Yeah, I mean, I think that we're on the same page of the same book, man. And I have to say that it's only recently, I was thinking about it tonight when I was putting my son to sleep, and I was like, man, I was like, when did this like awakening come, you know? And I really feel that it's only been like the last year where I've really started to ask myself the question of like, what makes me happy? Like what truly makes me happy, you know? And I'm a creative too. And if you're a creative and you're listening, please leave a comment. Let us know what you do and if you're feeling this or not. But like as a creative, like it makes me happy when people see like my work, but there's another side of that too, which is
Yeah.
it's never quite good enough.
Right,
Um,
right.
so it doesn't matter. Sometimes it doesn't matter what people think. It's just not good enough for me, you know. But I think that in the last year, the biggest revelation that I've come to is that it is not anyone else's responsibility or job to make me happy. Where my
Hmm.
happiness comes from does not depend on other people. Because if it
Sure.
does, then I'm guaranteed failure because people are broken
Yeah.
and everyone is going through some kind of shit,
Hmm.
you know? And so that took a long time. I mean, look, I'm married too. I've got kids and stuff, and it's like, man, it's like, is it my wife's job to make me happy? The
Hmm.
answer to that is no.
Yeah.
Despite what we've seen in the movies
Right.
and
Well,
the fairy tales.
that's actually a really interesting point. So we, I think my wife is okay with me sharing this story. It's about anxiety, and she's definitely struggled with it herself. I was making a list the other night of all the anxiety that I could remember our family dealing with in the last 2 years. And
Wait, can you hold this thought? Can you just
sure.
define anxiety? Can you define it?
Oh gosh. Um, for me, the anxiety is when it's essentially like emotional concrete that your feet are just stuck in. And for me, it's that dark cloud, that feeling of just being, and I feel like it's a moving target too, because I think it can be different for everybody. But anxiety for me is when I'm just feeling overwhelmed and stuck in my own head and starting to listen to and believe things that aren't real. Things that
Like the voices in our heads.
the voices that, yeah, the lies that we believe, the narrative that our story doesn't matter,
Yeah.
the narrative that says you're not good enough. Why are you going to go on this Facebook Live tonight? Because no one cares about you,
Yeah.
and you're not good enough. And who are you to even say that you have any authority in anything? It's the same as a creative. Whenever you're sending that email with that script in there that's going to those producers, and you're like, I have poured 5 years of my life into this. Best of luck. I don't know. So yeah, I don't know that I can truly define what anxiety is, because I think it's really hard to pinpoint it. But
Well,
for
I think you
me,
said emotional, like your emotional concrete, like your feet are in emotional concrete.
mhm,
I
yeah,
think that's a really interesting way to look at it. I don't think I've looked at it like that. That's interesting.
yeah, and it holds you back from enjoying certain things.
Hmm.
So um, when oh gosh, we're going way back now. But when my wife and I were just first married, well, I guess no, it was a little while after. We went to Hershey Park, which is an amusement park nearby in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and I got on this ride to go on this roller coaster, one of my favorite roller coasters, and the guy can't close the lap bar because I'm too big to fit into the seat,
Mm,
and I have to get off the ride in front of all these people. And it
mm,
was like that. It's like anxiety's like that. It's restricting you from enjoying life. It's restricting you from enjoying the things that you want to do. And then it keeps beating you down until you're like, why bother doing anything? Like, I'm just going to
mm,
be an observer in life instead of an active participant. And
mm,
in the form of storytelling, you have your protagonist is either passive or active. There's really no in between. Either they're watching things happen to them, or they're actively engaging and making something happen. And when you're the lead in your own life story, like, you have to be active and you have to be pursuing something. Otherwise, you're passive and life is happening to you.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, man. I want to ask too, where do those voices come from?
It's a really good question. Um, I can't speak to everybody's story or anyone else's narrative, but for myself, the doubt comes when you start to make the announcement that you're doing something. When you announce, like, hey, I'm gonna write a movie, I'm gonna film a movie, the resistance is real. I don't know if you've ever read the book The War of Art. um, I believe that's
No.
Stephen Pressfield. The book is, I believe it's divided up into two chapters, and the first part of the book is called The Resistance. And man, I'll tell you, the resistance is real. When you have anything that you're actively pursuing, the resistance shows itself.
Yeah.
because it's testing you. It's like, are you serious about this? Are you really going to get up every morning at 5 and go to the gym? Are you really going to eat that many calories a day? Are you really going to pursue what you say you're passionate about? It's going to test you, and it's always going to make you focus in and say, you're going to dig your heels in. I don't know if you can see this, but I have a sign in my office that reminds me constantly to do hard things.
Mm.
That was
Yeah, I love that,
my,
man. I've seen you wearing that T-shirt a couple times.
yeah,
I love it, man. Do hard things. I think it's so cool.
yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah, that always reminds me that anything's possible. So I don't know if you followed my health journey over the last year,
Mm-mm.
but in December of 2017, I weighed over 400 pounds. Um,
Whoa.
so and I carried that weight for about 15 years.
Wow.
On and off, I lost like 20, 30 pounds here, gained it back, and then some. And I was really living in the and then some phase of life where I was being very passive in life, and just life was happening to me. I was living in excuses. Obviously, anxiety, those things those voices are very loud when you don't feel like somebody that's valuable. You have this own narrative that you're telling yourself about your own life, and true or not, it's still a very loud voice in your head that's saying, this is who you are and this is what you are.
Yeah.
Um, so
But that has to
my
come from somewhere, John. It has to come from somewhere. Like otherwise, I would have to believe that we as human beings are from the womb self-destructive.
hmm,
And I can't believe that. I cannot believe, like, I'm a faith guy too. So I believe, hey, if we're created in the image and likeness of God,
yeah,
I think there's a couple of things I just wanted to mention here because you're talking about like the voice. We're talking about the voices
hmm,
in our head, the voices we speak to ourselves, meeting resistance. When we talk about faith and stuff, and they talk about God and they talk about the word,
yeah,
right? It was as if the world and all we know was spoken into existence.
hmm, yeah,
I think that's very beautiful and I think that's very powerful. And then on
sure,
top of that, we have, as we move on, we have the word was made flesh,
sure,
you know? And I think that these words and the power of these words, like, I believe that we all have a voice inside of us, but I don't know if I can believe that we're born in the image of likeness of God and then we're telling ourselves that we suck.
yeah,
Like I think that like that those voices have to be put in there somewhere early on in the early developmental stages, whether we remember it or not. Either it's environmental, external, or internal or nuclear family, whether it's coming from family or coming from school or
yeah,
whatnot.
sure,
Somewhere in there, there is something that happens where the program kind of gets hacked, and
yeah,
once that program is hacked, it needs to be like, hacked again to get out of that.
hmm,
And it's usually something traumatic or some suffering or a terrible experience or life threatening, uh, most of the time that gets us out of that hack,
yeah,
you know? But I think that, I don't know, I'm asking these questions because I really do want to know. Like, I can't say that I suffer from, anxiety and depression, but I know many people that do, that talk about it, and people very close to me talk about, having anxiety, and I think that it's just something that's important. Like I want to know the origins, I guess.
sure. Yeah, I'm actually really comfortable with talking about my origin because I've lived through it, I've survived it, and I've moved on. It may be a little uncomfortable for some people, but I was sexually abused at 6 years old by an 11-year-old girl, and her name was Summer. And I just became aware, gosh, about 6 years ago that I was a victim of
Mm-hmm.
sexual abuse. And
Jeez.
she, I had no idea what was going on. I'm 5 years old, 6 years old. I don't know what's happening. And then like I said, I told you, I remember very vividly when I was that age that I started suffering with anxiety because I started to question and doubt all these
Mm-hmm.
things that I had known to be truth. Now, those things were questioned, brought into question, and my world kind of started to get really small. When you're a kid, you feel like your world's gigantic. Your imagination is huge. Anything can happen, and then all of a sudden it's like, who can I trust? Like, I thought this was a friend. I thought this was like, what is this? You know, and it was only until I was 31 years old, and I didn't realize this because I had played this narrative in my head where I had forgiven, where I had tried to talk about this with other people. And I was actually doing an interview for with a group of parents who had children who were sexually abused by by a school staff member, by a teacher or something like that. There's an actual uh, local chapter that they wanted to do a video series about this. And so I was doing some investigating, and they were friends of mine, so I knew them from work and so forth. And um, I shared with them, I was like, like when I was 6, like this happened to me. And they were like, really? Like, have you ever gone to counseling for that? And I was just like, what are you talking about? Um, like I'd always carried around this idea that it was my fault, that I did something wrong. And even in the moment when it happened, I remember riding home being like so terrified that I was going to get in trouble. For this
Was
act
it
that
one
happened.
time that happened, or was it over the
Yes.
course of?
No, it
It
was
one
one
time.
time. It was one time.
Hmm.
And I know that there are
And
a
she
lot
was
of,
11.
she was 11. Yeah. She was about
That's kind of
4 or
young
6
too,
years
though.
old.
I mean, is
Sure.
this?
Yeah. So when I was, in my early 30s, and it was kind of revealed to me that this had happened and it was real, and I had all this guilt. And I remember thinking, sorry to back up, but I remember thinking when I was younger, when I got like to be 12, I started to enter into a really dark season of depression it felt like it lasted for years. It probably lasted for like 2 or 3 months. Um, but I remember thinking, I want to be a big guy so I can protect myself, so nobody can hurt me again.
Hmm.
Almost saying, I want to put up walls and never feel anything again. That's really what it felt like.
Yeah.
Um, Food became my comfort, and my prison.
Wow.
Um, yeah. So in my 30s, when I first started to really dive into this and seek counseling for it, um, I realized that this girl most likely was a victim herself.
Yeah. I'd have to say so too, man. 11 years old, like
Yeah.
that's pretty. That's very young.
Yeah. Yeah. And then replaying all the memories with her, leading up to that day, and just knowing that the group of people that were around our neighborhood and so forth. Um, and not to write a story that doesn't exist, but I was like, I wonder, like, was this a consistent thing for her? Was this a part of her life? Like, had this happened to her multiple times? And so I was really moved into forgiving her, and moving beyond that act, instead of letting it define who I was and leave me stuck where I was. I wanted
Yeah.
to move past it. And anger is not going to solve the problem. you know Loving other people is going to solve that problem. Like I said, when you're a possessor of knowledge, you're inclined to give that away. And dude, love and forgiveness is one of the most powerful it is are the most powerful tools we have in our toolkit.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm working with a non-for-profit organization right now, creating some video material for them. And their ministry is helping people heal who have been emotionally abused, sexually abused, physically abused.
Sure.
And it is what I've learned is that, there are some people um, where when this happens to them, this is how they identify,
Hmm.
and they're unable to they just haven't gotten past that yet. This is how they identify, and that's that. So for
Yeah.
me, listening to your story now, talking about how you've kind of this happened, you acknowledge that it happened, and you've moved on from that. I think is very, very valuable for people who are suffering for things. Look, things happen to us, and they're not our fault,
Sure.
good and bad.
Yep.
They're
Yep.
not our fault. And the reality is that like we cannot allow these things to become who we are.
Right. 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 That's basically giving over the pen and saying, this is going to write my narrative for me.
Yeah.
This is going to define me, and this is going to be who I am. I'm going to be a victim for the next 50 years of my life if I'm so lucky. That is a terrifying reality that I saw where that was taking me. My health was in great decline, just constantly. Um, I was constantly indulging, in the comforts, and just trying to be comfortable,
Mm.
whether that was with food, whether that was with just Netflix and chill, whatever that was. I never had an addiction to drugs or alcohol or anything like that. But man, like my vices were still just as real, and as a creative, I'm a very empathetic person. So when I'm diving into a project where I'm writing something, I am living that person's life. Like I am just invested into that mentality, and it's really hard for me to let go and to get out of that. So I totally have to. Sometimes I have to put the brakes on and say this project can't move forward because I cannot live in that headspace right now. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Man, I want to read some of the comments here because we've got people that are just saying negative self-talk and thoughts are the root of anxiety and depression. Anxiety has produced panic attacks that have actually kept me from walking into a store. I think the voice comes from a deep-rooted depression, and same as John, weight issues contribute to those feelings. Kate's here. How you doing, Kate? Joe's here. How you doing? We've got Christina says you're not alone. Um, and it's so hard to forgive and move forward, coming from Angie. I think that do you think that forgiveness plays a role in the suffering that you face? Like you've had to forgive to get past it?
Yeah, I think so. And I believe there is a season, I think there's a season of stillness where you can, and I think forgiveness is a tricky thing because saying you forgive somebody and then living in that forgiveness is really difficult. Um, I think when I first said the words, it actually made me more angry. Because if
Mm,
I would have seen that person, I don't know that I would have been as comfortable as I feel now, praying for them,
yeah,
wishing them well, hoping that they have found healing. Because
yeah,
it's a scar,
yeah,
depending on what that is, that can be a deep scar. Um,
yeah. Yeah, some the project I'm working on now is directly, like I said, working with people who've suffered from abuse, giving a voice to survivors of abuse. And one of the things that was shared with me was this idea of maintenance. That this idea of when someone who has faced abuse and has been abused or has suffered from some kind of external abuse, um, many people's ideas are, well, that just happened to you so many years ago. Can't you just get over it? Why can't you just get over this? And I would have to say, if I say honestly, that's probably where my mentality would be as well. But what I learned from this experience was that they said that this was more of, the project that I'm working on with them is talking about maintenance. This idea of therapy, working through it, but understanding that like that scar is always going to be there.
sure.
And so it
Yeah.
needs to be tended to, it needs to be cleaned, it needs to be taken care of. And as we go through our life, there are other things that come up that can trigger some of these ideas or thoughts or feelings and send us into a very negative space again. Um,
Absolutely.
so, so for people out there who are suffering with anxiety and depression, what what are some of the tools that you could share?
I think it's it's tricky because you have to be willing to be vulnerable at a certain point.
Yeah,
And
that's the
not
key, isn't it?
it really is, because I mean, just like your first the first video that you saw me do live, saying that, hey, I'm going live on anxiety here, being very vulnerable in the moment. Um, I- you know, I would never ask anybody to be brave beyond how they felt comfortable. Me sharing my story tonight is not to say, hey, I'm at this amazing place that I can speak about this stuff because it doesn't affect me. It still affects me.
Yeah,
I lived as a class clown for over a decade, masking what had happened, the hurt and the pain, and bigger guys like me were always, chuckling and making jokes and always trying to be the funny guy so that you would never ever think something was wrong.
yeah,
Um, So I think you have to finally pull down that facade and say, um, you need to surround yourself with someone you're comfortable being vulnerable with. Back in 2013, really close friends of mine and I, we formed a little group that we literally created a safe place, for men of accountability, um, to encourage one another, to share our struggles, to share our wounds, and to seek support. And
Yeah.
surrounding yourself with people, even though they couldn't identify 100% with my struggle or with my story, you know, I couldn't necessarily identify with theirs 100% either, but we were there together in our suffering, and encouraging one another and reading scripture and, listening to Brennan Manning talk about God loves you just as you are and not as you're supposed to be, because you're never going to be how you're supposed to be, and that was a powerful message for me to hear, where it was like, oh, like I don't have to reach this certain level to be accepted or to be loved or to be this whatever ideal version of myself that I think I need to be. Um, I always used to say this, like, God loves me naked and in the shower, the same as he does dressed up on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
There's no difference to him. He is totally colorblind. He's seeing through all the facades, all the walls we're building up anyway.
Yeah.
But you need to find somebody that you can be real with. And specifically, you need to learn how to be real with yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you talk about God, you talk about these kinds of things. I have to say that for me, Christianity is the only religion where God comes down to man.
Sure.
Every
Yeah.
other religion is trying to get to God.
Mm-hmm.
Never can get there. You could never be perfect. Christianity is the only religion that avails itself to God coming down to man and being that bridge,
Yeah.
and to me, that makes perfect sense,
And not
because, as I
even
said, we're
just,
broken.
and not only just coming down and meeting us, but then reaching a hand out and taking the dirty, filthy hand of man and pulling him up.
Yeah.
There's a massive illustration of that when, Peter is walking on water and he's sinking, and Jesus, reaches in and rescues him, and as he's drowning, and Jesus got his hands dirty, like that's the coolest part. It's like, yeah, I love people I can relate to, like
Yeah.
I feel like Instagram and Facebook and how you can prettify life, and make it glossy and clean and sleek. Dude, underneath all of this is filthy rags, like
Yeah.
it's so tough to be honest if you're not willing to admit, hey, like this is life. Life is messy, life is dirty, and it's never going to be squeaky clean. And I feel like when you can put down the phone, when you can put down that social media and that ideal of what that life looks like, and say, you know what, I need to be brutally honest with myself, and this is what being raw, being real, and being honest is all about. I think there's great victory in just
Yeah.
truly just saying, where am I? You know, if you believe that
Yeah.
your bank account has $100,000 in it and you're spending like you have $100,000, but when you go to withdraw money from the ATM and you see a negative balance, and like it's going to tell you exactly what you've been spending. Like you have to be real with yourself. You have to do that check-in, and you have to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, man, I think that's so super valuable. I mean, everything that you're saying here, I just want to get in here. Christina says, I love that you're so strong. You need that strength. I have a question for myself. Does it get easier to talk about? I'm a very open person, but some things seem to be hard for me to get out. What do you
I
think?
think
Does it get easier to talk about?
I think it does. I don't think it gets easier to deal with, maybe to an extent, but I would say it does get easier. Um, Over the past 6 years of my life, this, dealing with what happened to me when I was 6 years old, being abused by this girl, uh, is it was such a mountain, such a weight that was on my shoulders for so many years. And the moment that I brought it up, it really lost a lot of power. It lost a lot of stronghold over me.
Yeah.
But it didn't completely go away. I would throw the shackles back on and drag that ball and chain around even longer. But slowly over time, you carry the scars around with you. But I believe over time it does get easier, because again, you're a possessor of that knowledge. You're a possessor of what you've lived through. Your story has power. And when you can then impart that wisdom, your story has power to it. And when you can impart that on other people, it's then going to help them, it's going to help break chains there. And so
Yeah.
as we're keeping these stories to ourselves, we're actually cheating other people from the freedom that we've encountered. There's a great quote from the leader of an organization that I'm a part of, that I'm a health coach for. Your story could be the key that unlocks somebody else's prison. Dude, that is so powerful.
Heck yeah, man. Yeah, I mean, first of all, yes, that is incredibly powerful. I want to come back to this voice, man, because I think that may be the answer. I think that being real, I know that the more we talk about, look, if we're afraid of that monster under the bed,
Hmm.
the longer we stay in that bed, the bigger that monster gets.
Sure. Oh
You
yeah.
know, you've got to, like, I think the key is that you've got to slay the dragon early.
Yeah.
You've got to catch the cancer early. You've got to address, the monster under the bed as soon as possible, because it's in the absence of using that beautiful voice that we've been given, to share and to talk about our story, that that opposing force, whatever that is, grows in power, you
Hmm.
know? And it starts off, and I think this is really, really important too. It starts off in our lives where when we don't say no, when we know we should have said no, when we don't say yes, when we know we should have said yes. It could be in the smallest of circumstances, with family, with friends, at our job. It doesn't matter. The moment we go down that road, we lose a little bit of our power, and that opposing force gains in power.
Hmm.
And if we don't correct that, then what happens is, and I've said this before on the show, what happens is that we continually lose power and lose our voice. And when we don't have our voice, we run the danger of becoming an invisible person, a person that doesn't know who he is or she is anymore, because we have been afraid to face that dragon and that monster under our bed and talk about this stuff. And the reality is that sometimes that's all we need to do,
Yeah.
is just talk about it. Do the hard thing.
I think you nail it. Absolutely. And that voice I believe it's such, as a creative anyway, I feel like that voice is sometimes necessary. Because you need the resistance to know how strong you are. You need the resistance to know how to do hard things. And
Mm,
the great thing I love about this saying too is the harder that thing appears, that obstacle appears to be, and the more times you go at it, the easier it gets.
yeah.
A good analogy I can think of is, I love cycling, and so when you tackle that massive hill the first time, you think you're gonna die getting up that hill, but the more
That'd be
you
me.
do
I would be
it,
dying.
the more you do it, and the more times you're putting in the reps, and you're pedaling, and you're finding your cadence, and you're finding your groove, and you're working your way up that hill. I mean, and for me, like I had to change the circumstances. Over the past year, my weight loss story has, my weight has gone down significantly. And so I have one
Congrats.
specific hill in mind. Thank you. I have one specific hill in mind that I rode up in November of 2017. I thought I was going to pass out when I got to the top of that hill. And on Father's Day last year, I rode up that same hill, and I was sweating, but I wasn't dying. And it was so much easier. But I had to do it because I needed to prove to myself that that hill wasn't as hard anymore. And
Yeah.
sometimes you need to go back into the ring and get hit a couple more times just to realize, okay, I have something else to work on.
Yeah.
It's
Man,
when you,
John, that's so key, man. People ask, we've been talking now for a while. We've talked to a lot of different people, but like suffering is the key to this.
yeah,
People say, why do we suffer? Why do we suffer? Why do we suffer? Why am I suffering? If people could just look at their suffering for just a moment and understand there is great power in that suffering, that
sure,
uncomfortability. Like, look, when we're young, we're taught to, brush our teeth in the morning, brush our teeth at night. These are habits that we develop over time.
sure,
But
yeah,
there are other very, very healthy emotional and mental habits that have
mm,
not been taught over time that
yeah,
we are now coming to and understand. Look, 30 years ago, people weren't, going to meditate before work or on their lunch
right,
break. You know what I
sure,
mean? But,
yeah,
the world is changing and we're becoming more understanding of the reality of the importance of our emotional health,
hmm
and the
hmm
benefits of that.
yeah. Yeah, and I think something I've this last the last month I've really been working on something very specifically, which is self-love.
Yeah. That was a hard one
January,
for me, dude.
dude, it is really tough. It is
I
very tough,
know.
especially when you're walking through, anxiety and you're believing those voices, and you let them overtake you to a point, and listen, I had such high hopes for this year being a specific, going a specific way and, doing hard things, even harder things this year. And man, when you ask for something, you're going to get it. You're going to be tested in it. And
Yeah.
for sure, I think self-love is really hard, simply because, we're human, we're faltered, we're not perfect, and I think the thing that I kept struggling with the most, coming back to it, was just this feeling of inadequacy. Like I used to hide behind my weight, I used to hide behind, that was my excuse, for all of this stuff. Now that's gone.
Yeah.
Now what do I have to hide behind? Like when I feel vulnerable in a way that I don't want to put myself out there,
Yeah.
being vulnerable, living a life of vulnerability is different than just being vulnerable, right?
Absolutely.
So living a life that is completely vulnerable, you're going to, that looks so much different than saying, hey, I'm going to be vulnerable here and share something specific with you. But when your life is shaped in that way, I feel like you're almost even set up even more for attack potentially. And you're almost inviting those things in at a greater rate of speed, where it's like, oh my gosh, um, so many things, there's so much pressure, there's so much whatever is going on in life. There's yeah, I think, for me, January was the season where it was time to catch my breath, and all this self-doubt started to hit, and I
Yeah.
started to really internalize, and I started to really step back and go, oh my gosh, like I feel so out of control. My feet are back into that emotional cement and I can't move forward. What do I do? Like, how do I get out of this? And it was giving that voice total domination of the narrative, and it was not a comfortable season. And I would love to tell you that I am completely out of it now, but I'm not,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of it might have to do with self-discipline and learning to just unplug. I've definitely unplugged a lot in the last month, and I feel like it's really gained me a lot of just headspace and a lot of time to breathe. I wish I had more. I wish I had more space to breathe, but I feel like I've gained a lot of that just by taking that step and saying, I need to do this for me. I really do need to focus on self-care right now
Yeah.
and self-love.
Yeah. Man, I'll tell you what's been working for me is just reminding myself every single day, telling myself every single day that I don't give a shit what anyone thinks. That has been the key, man. I'm not even playing, just
Yep.
not giving a shit about what other people think of me, because as a creative, we work so hard to create something of artistic value, and then we put that into the world, and we hope that like a piece of our heart is there that touches other people's hearts. And
Right.
and so I think I've struggled with that for a long time, and I've made an active decision, at least through this I Choose series, to not give a shit what anyone thinks. Because you
Yeah.
know what? Everyone's got their own life to live, and I've got mine. And the only person I can compare myself to is Michael Campo of yesterday.
Yeah. That's it.
That's it.
That's it.
You know.
Yeah.
Jen says, yes, the argument of if God were real, there'd be no suffering frustrates me. If there's no suffering, how would we even recognize? How would we overcome and then empower others with our story? It's sad, but it's a necessary part of life. We agree. I agree with you, Jen.
Absolutely. Wow.
Well, I have to say, John, we're coming to the end here. Is there anything specifically that you really wanted to say via this conversation? I know that you talked about the sexual abuse. You talked about the weight loss transformation, which huge, man. Talk about doing hard things, still being in it, living in a state of vulnerability. I mean, I think that these things that we're talking about here they're very, very valuable for anyone and everyone, no matter where they come from or what they're going through. Is there anything specific that you just wanted to put out there?
Yeah, I think I really want people to understand that your story isn't always about you. There's a great lie in thinking that this is my story. I have to tell my story because it's all about me. I learned a valuable lesson, especially, and I think kids really helps with this lesson as well, that your story needs to be helping other people and
Mm,
helping those people navigate. Again, you're a possessor of knowledge. You're inclined to give that away. My wife and I, so we've used my story to, I should say our stories to formulate what our family looks like. My daughters are well aware that there is never a topic that's off the table. Like we can talk about anything. We will be a vulnerable family. My children, when they were 6 years old, they were told that daddy had something happen to him, and we were very open about it because this is just unfortunately the world we live in, and not
yeah.
everybody has everyone else's best interest in mind, and they need to understand what's okay and what's not. And again, if I do my I do have friends that that their parents never talked to them about anything. My mom was always extremely open about everything, even as awkward as it could be at times. I am so grateful and so blessed that she just didn't care, and she just didn't care what anybody thought, but she would tell me the truth, and the truth, even though it can hurt at times, it could potentially save somebody's life, and for my wife and I, like we have made that staple that there's never a topic that's off limits. It gets a little uncomfortable sometimes when your kids are asking you, what does this word mean? You're like, oh Lord, what do we say? But we're just honest with them, uh, kids say the darndest things, and in our house it's equally true.
Well, John, I gotta thank you, man, so much just for being vulnerable, and and living your walking your path, walking your path and sharing your story with other people. I definitely believe that our stories can unlock. What did you say? Unlock another person's prison?
Yeah, our story might be the key that unlocks somebody else's prison.
Yeah, I love that, man. I think that's super, super important. And I'm really, really grateful that we had an opportunity to have this conversation. I think that, the stuff we spoke about tonight and what you shared, I think is going to be very, very vulnerable for people out there who are suffering. And you know me, man, I'm going to cut this up into a couple of pieces and blast it out all over the internet because
Yeah.
Dude, there's value here, man. Super valuable. So I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you for your honesty, your vulnerability, and doing the hard thing.
Well, thank you so much. You're doing equally hard things, dude. You're totally a collector of these stories, and I love all of the variety of stories that you have that you've collected so far, and it's just been encouraging. It's so funny when you hear somebody else's story. Um, it's just amazing that you can totally identify with them in ways you never thought you'd be able to. Connect
I
on a
know.
level you're like, wow, like everybody has a story.
I know.
How come if we could only take the time to listen? And I think
Yeah.
you've given a great and safe space for people to do that. So I
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, thank you, man. That means a lot to me. We're trying hard. We're working it, man. That's the goal, you know. Like you had mentioned when you were younger about having that place where you had a group of guys come together and talk and support each other. That's the vision for what like our I Choose Facebook and I Choose Instagram can be, you know. It can be
Yeah.
that place where, you know, you're on your phone, you're scrolling through your Facebook feed. I want something positive to pop up and everyone who's following the I Choose series, I want something positive to post up or to be scrolled up every time they're going through their social networks and see something that inspires them to be who they're supposed to be.
Love it. I love it. That's
So,
so powerful. And it's so
yeah.
necessary in this day and age too. You just never know what somebody's wrestling with. We get so angry when somebody cuts us off in traffic. You have no idea what that person's going through. And I think when you can live empathetically towards others, and just put yourself in their shoes, even for a moment, or you hear a story that you're like, I totally connected with that.
Yeah.
It's powerful. It's so
Yeah.
powerful. And it lets you know that you're not alone. Like that
Absolutely, man.
there's so much power in that. Knowing that, oh my gosh, I'm not the only person that deals with this. Like there is so much power in that.
Yeah. Well, man, let's slay the monster under the bed, you know? You got to
Let's do
face
it.
it. So, all right, thanks so much, John. It was a pleasure, man. I'm really grateful. Would you come on again sometime?
I would love to.
All right, great, man. Well, thank you so much. We'll catch you on the rebroadcast.
Sounds good.
All right. Talk to you soon, man. Thanks.